Okay, so moving right along, we're going to close out our lecture by talking about our second story, which is Everyday Use by Alice Walker. And we're going to continue our discussion of how do we relate to others in our communities. In this case, we're moving on from kind of the geographical city or town or village community to even more specifically the family unit as a community. So sibling to sibling, parent to child, child to parent, etc. And I think this is one of the best stories ever written on family dynamics and sibling relationships. There's another great story on sibling relationships we'll read in a few weeks called Sonny's Blues, but I think this is one of the best ones. And got the picture of Alice Walker here. She's one of the most prominent African American writers in our country. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel The Color Purple, which is a classic. And so I'm very excited to discuss the story with you for a number of reasons. A little bit on Alice Walker herself. As usual, this is a much more recent story. I believe she wrote it in the 1980s. So much more recent than other things we've studied. But there's a quotation. I used to teach this story out of a textbook. And there was a quotation from Alice Walker in that textbook that I think is really relevant here. So I'm going to share that quotation with you, which says, I was curious to know why people in families, specifically black families, she adds, are often cruel to each other, and how much of this cruelty is caused by outside forces, such as various social injustices, segregation, unemployment, etc. I think this is an absolutely critical question. It's so important, and it relates to our discussion of how do we relate to people in our communities and in what forms identity, self or community. I think these questions are all related and crucial to understanding human existence. So, Walker makes the claim here that people are often cruel to each other in families. And she says specifically black families, but she puts that in parentheses. So I think she's saying she is particularly concerned with seeing this pattern in black families, but I think she's introducing the idea that it happens in all families. And speaking from my own experience, I've seen, a lot of strife in my own family growing up, much cruelty and other things toward each other. And so I think this is both a specific question, but it also deals with universal experience. But the question is, what is the cause of this tension, this strife, this cruelty? And she gives some potential examples of social injustices, segregation with the African American families here, unemployment, etc., other things that would kind of fall into that category. But these are all what we'd call outside forces, to use Walker's term. So you're talking about an internal struggle, strife or cruelty within the family, but caused by outside forces. So in other ways, you could say living conditions, for instance, might cause more strife than living conditions in another circumstance. Just kind of giving you a framework to think about this question. That's just one example. But I think it's an absolutely critical, important question. And so we can think about how do we see this play out in the story, right? Because there's deep tension amongst the Johnson family here, and cruelty, at least on the part of Dee, toward the other characters, I would argue. But there's outside forces at play because Dee is very concerned about her family's heritage and her identity. She's, and you could say to an extent, fixated on what her identity is. And certainly social forces, social injustices have shaped her fixation on that identity. But this story also tells about their childhood from a very early age. There's references to things that happened when they were quite young. And so there's a lot to consider with this question. There's like our guiding questions for this class. This could be up there with them. There's not an easy answer, but I think this story will help us think about it in really productive ways. And so I just throw out, are people in all families cruel to each other? And I think, yes, at some point. And so we're dealing with something that this story depicts specifically with African American families and perhaps some conditions that are unique there. But certainly human nature is to not be kind to others and our families. I think that's more true than in other places because we're with them all the time and we don't have a choice about that until we're older. A few more things about Alice Walker I want to share with you before we move on because she's a truly amazing person and writer. Her right eye was covered by a scar until she was 14, and then the scar healed. And this caused her to become more withdrawn. So she's very observant of people's actions because she just kind of stood back and watched. She wasn't really included in her actions until she was older. And she makes the claim that this made her a better writer because she was such an observer of human nature. And I'm inclined to agree because when you read a story like this, I come away thinking, man, she really nailed human nature. She really gets these family dynamics. I can relate to these dynamics to a certain extent. She coined the term womanist, which means black feminist. And like I mentioned earlier, she won the Pulitzer Prize for The Color Purple in 1982, which was then made into a successful award-winning film. So just, some information about Alice Walker here to help us understand our author as we dive into this interesting, complex, important. So what are the main themes/threads we're going to pull on as we do our close reading? I think characterization is hugely important in this story. You have Maggie, Dee, and Mama as the three main characters, and there's certainly a narrative, but it's different, say, from The Lottery. It's very different from The Lottery. I've intentionally paired the two stories this way because The Lottery is all about plot, right? Characters are very static in The Lottery. They don't really change or grow. They're not dynamic. They're just kind of there to serve a purpose. But the plot builds and builds and builds in The Lottery until we realize the twist at the end, and that's the mind-blowing part of the story. Here you do have a narrative, and you do have a tension, and you do have a good twist at the end with who receives the quilts, but it's mainly about characterization. Who is Maggie? Who is Dee? Who is Mama? And these are incredibly complex, dynamic characters. All three of them. The only static character here is the boyfriend. And so each of these characters is complex, multifaceted, nuanced. We can't reduce them to a single thought or even a single sentence. We see multiple sides of their personalities. And a lot happens in just, one afternoon here. So we're really going to talk in detail about the characters, what they're like, what we learn from them, etc. One character I really find interesting in particular is Mama because she's the narrator, and she's an unreliable narrator. She self-admits that she struggles with memory, she's uneducated, and she's certainly obviously going to be biased. These are her daughters, are the focal points of the stories, so she certainly can't be objective. And I think, it can be hard to write a narrator like that. And so we see the brilliance of Walker's writing in the narration and depiction of Mama and this character who, we really truly believe she's their mother, and that informs how we read the story. But I think it's really important to ask, why would Mama be the narrator? Why not make someone else the narrator? Why not use a third person narrator? And so there's a lot to think about with the choice of Mama as the narrator, and her unreliability is a factor there. Obviously, what the story is mainly about is family, particularly sibling tension. As I've mentioned before in this lecture, I think every family has tension and strife, and there's always tension and strife between siblings. Some families more pronounced, more intense than others, but it's always there. And I think this story gives us one of the most intense examples, but also an incredibly thorough exploration of that tension, and that's what makes this a brilliant, beautiful story. The title, Everyday Use, is so important. We really get the meaning, the message of this story when we understand the title. And I think part of what makes a story important and brilliant comes through what its title communicates to us. And so we'll definitely talk about the title. Finally, cultural heritage. The story is all about heritage in a sense because the quilts have been handed down through multiple generations, not just from Mama, but from the grandma as well, and perhaps even farther back. And so heritage is very important here. But Dee, or Wanjero, if we want to call her Wanjero, is also very interested in heritage going even farther back to when their ancestors were still in Africa, before the slave trade. And so when we talk about cultural heritage, this story becomes so much more important than it even more important than it seems just on the surface. And you're dealing with really two different cultures, an African culture and an African American culture. And they're both incredibly important, and particularly incredibly important to the characters here. and shape the interaction, shape the tension. And so we'll see how the different characters, their beliefs about heritage, family, cultural heritage, how that impacts their decisions, their actions. Okay, so let's dive into the story and take a look at these characters we've just been talking about in much more detail by looking at actual quotations from the story. So I first ask, what is significant about Mama's characterization of herself? So when you read Mama describe herself in her narration, what stands out or seems important? You have probably highlighted quotes, probably some really good ones. So this might be an excellent point to pause the lecture and refer to your notes and refer to your copy of the text. I'm going to go ahead and share a quote that really stood out to me, and you can think about what is significant Mama says about herself in this quote. In real life, I am a large, big-boned woman with rough, man-working hands. In the winter, I wear flannel nightgowns to bed and overalls during the day. I can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. My fat keeps me hot in zero weather. I can work outside all day, breaking ice to get water for washing. I can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. So pause, maybe jot down some reflections here on what this quote tells us. I think this quote is really significant for a number of reasons. One, I find her interesting, her comparing herself to a man. I think the point here is that she is providing and caring for the family. So she's somewhat masculine in terms of her hands and her stature, but moreover, she's masculine in her role. And that's really important because she's provided and cared for these girls and bringing them up. And so to a certain extent, she's authority on their lives and perhaps the most important person to each of them, potentially. I'm conjecturing there's some, but I think we can infer that to an extent from the text. And we can see how she's able to provide. She can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. So they have food to eat. She says she's a large, big-boned woman, and her fat keeps her hot in zero weather. So the family seems, relatively speaking, pretty poor here. And so, she's saying her size even is convenient in that it keeps her warm in zero weather. She can work outside all day to break ice to get water for washing. She can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire 5 minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. So she's a hard worker. She can provide everything her family needs. She works hard to care for her family, and she doesn't have, some of the inhibitions other people might have, right? She can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. Other people in other circumstances might be more reserved about that. She is a person who has to just get things done and get down to business and take care of business because her life is not an easy one and raising her family on her own. So we really get a really full, thorough, clear picture of Mama here, and understanding her character is very important going forward. Some more questions I could ask, and this is kind of like a 3-part question for number 2 here. Now that we've looked at Mama, what is significant about her characterizations of Maggie and Dee? And I say her characterizations of Maggie and Dee because she is the narrator. And so we need to look at descriptions of Maggie and Dee as well, so that we have quotes describing all 3 of our main characters, because remember, characterization is so important. But as we look at these next 2 passages that deal with Maggie and Dee, we need to keep in mind that this is Mama telling us. So our perspective is filtered by her. And we can ask the question, why do you think Walker chose to make Mama the narrator? And finally, how are our perceptions of Maggie and Dee filtered by Mama's narration? In other words, I'll read this, pause it, jot down your reflections just as you did with Mama, but later on, as you visit your reflections, think about, we can tell that these reflections are coming from Mama. How would they be different if they came from a different character? And all that can get to the second perhaps most important question here is since we're getting our perceptions of these two most important characters in this specific way, why do you think Walker chose to do it this way? What point is she making or illustrating by having our perceptions of Maggie and Dee filtered by Mama? Here's the quote. Dee is lighter than Maggie, with nicer hair and a fuller figure. She's a woman now, though sometimes I forget. How long ago was it that the other house burned? 10, 12 years? Sometimes I can still hear the flames and feel Maggie's arm sticking to me, her hair smoking and her dress falling off her in black, papery flakes. Her eyes seemed stretched open, blazed open by the flames reflected in them. And Dee, I see her standing off under the sweet gum tree she used to dig gum out of, a look of concentration on her face, as she watched the last dingy gray board of the house fall in toward the red-hot brick chimney. Why don't you do a dance around the ashes? I wanted to ask her. She had hated that house so much. So, I think about this family and the house burning, and this is a hard quote to read. You probably could tell that as I was reading, but it's a very important quote. We learn so much here. Dee has a lot of the advantages, you could say, in life. Like she's more attractive, has nicer hair, etc. She's been able to go away from home and get educated. It doesn't say that here. And then you have all of this about the fire. And you even might think, as the next paragraph after this indicates, that maybe even Dee started the fire. She's certainly, glad that the house caught on fire. It seems like that. Remember, that's the way Mama, our unreliable narrator, presents it. And then also Maggie is scarred by the fire. So this contributes to, her appearance and perhaps her personality. This is a formative event from their childhood narrated via flashback here by Mama. So this is an incredibly important event, but it tells us a lot about Maggie and about Dee. Again, of course, filtered by Mama. So we've looked at the characterization of all three characters and how Mama's narration comes into play. It may have felt like that slide ended abruptly. There's so much more I could say about that passage, about Mama's narration, about Maggie and Dee. But again, in these lectures, I don't want to do all of it. I want to save as much as I can for the discussion board, for you to come up with some of the good original thoughts about this text. So having looked at the characters and having looked at Mama's narration in particular, I want to move on to looking at the title. Remember, what is the meaning of the title? Everyday use. Here's a good example. When she finished wrapping the dasher, the handle stuck out. I took it for a moment in my hands. You didn't even have to look close to see where hands pushing the dasher up and down to make butter had left a kind of sink in the wood. In fact, there were a lot of small sinks. You could see where thumbs and fingers had sunk into the wood. It was beautiful light yellow wood from a tree that grew in the yard where Big D and Stash had lived. So much in this quote. But the title, Everyday Use, is in the phrase, where hands pushing the dasher up and down to make butter had left a kind of sink in the wood. So you can see that there's a tradition, a cultural heritage here in this family of working with one's hands. They've left an imprint on this dasher that's used to make butter. You can see where hands have used it in the past. That's everyday use. And if we connect this back to the quote from Mama on the first of these close reading slides, we see that everyday use defines Mama's existence. And now it defines Maggie's existence as well. They do the work. They kill the hogs. They stand outside in the cold. They get the ice and the water to wash clothes. They survive in, poor circumstances and harsh winters and hot summers because of how they're made. And that's everyday use. And so it's this family community, the family at least of Mama and Maggie. Everyday use defines that familial community, defines their identities. But the text itself actually uses the phrase everyday use. This is just a description of it. So let's see what happens when the phrase, everyday use, is actually used by Dee in the story. And the question I want to have us guide this quote in this discussion is, the sisters intend to use the quilts in very different ways. Like, we've had this little family get together. It's kind of coming to a head. The story's wrapping up. The tension of the story comes to the forefront over the quilts, right? Dee has the true purpose of why she has come back this day is to get the quilts, but Mama had been saving them up for Maggie. So what plays out here? And we see as it plays out, we get the use of the phrase everyday use. But really the question to think about as I read this quote is, who should get the quilts? Like, whose side do you take in this debate, Maggie or Dee, and why? And ultimately, we'll talk about which side Mama takes and why. Maggie can't appreciate these quilts, she said. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. A little further along, Maggie concedes. She can have them, Mama, she said, like somebody used to never winning anything or having everything reserved for her. I can remember Grandma Dee without the quilts. And then Mama's response to Maggie conceding here, and in particular this description of Maggie, like somebody used to never winning anything. When I looked at her like that, something hit me in the top of my head and ran down to the soles of my feet. Just like when I'm in church and the Spirit of God touches me and I get happy and shout. I did something I never done before, hugged Maggie to me, then dragged her on into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Wangero's hands, and dumped them into Maggie's lap. Maggie just sat there on my bed with her mouth open. So much here. Everyday use, right? So I used the previous quote on the previous slide to give you a picture of what everyday use is. And I want you to have that picture in your mind so that when you read this quote, you got that here. Dee is completely slamming everyday use, calling it backward, saying, these quilts are an heirloom. They represent our African heritage. How dare you use them for everyday use? How dare you use them with hands? They'll become like that butter dish where you can see the marks of the hands that have used them for years. There's a whole part of this quote I left out just for space, because really this is the whole last page of the story I should have quoted, but I didn't want to take up multiple slides, so I left out a part where she says the quilts would get worn out and eventually destroyed. They would come apart after years of everyday use, and Dee thinks they should be hanging in a museum because she sees them as connected to her African heritage, which is very important as well. We don't want to neglect that here. So it's complicated, but we see what Dee thinks of everyday use, and we know from the previous quote that everyday use defines Mama's life and defines Maggie's life. And what you have here, I think, ultimately, is this is the climax of the story, and we know how it ends with Maggie getting the quilts. What you have is Dee has had all the advantages, right? She's the prettier one, the nicer hair. She didn't get burned by the fire. And here Maggie's just kind of like, fine, she can have them. What's important to Maggie is her memory of her grandma, and she's saying there's more than one way to remember her. But Mama stands up for Maggie here, and I think this is a very powerful passage where we see her stand up for Maggie. We even see that it's like a spiritual moment for her. Like, she believes the Holy Spirit's at work in this moment, that she has realized the tension between her daughters and sided with a daughter who hasn't had a lot of support over the years, hasn't had a lot of people telling her she's great, who's just kind of reconciled to this life of everyday use. And she gives her the reward, so much so that Maggie is truly stunned, as we see in the final sentence there. So this is a powerful moment. It's a cathartic moment. When I read this, I'm like punching my hand in the air like I do almost like when my favorite team scores a touchdown. Like, I'm so happy for Maggie in this moment. But I add a but there, because I think this story is much more complex than certainly there's an important thing going on here where the child who is not been as favored receives a reward. But there's more to it than that. It's a complex story, and Walker intentionally writes Dee in a way that we're not very sympathetic to her. Like, Walker makes Dee kind of a mean character, so we're not immediately inclined to be sympathetic with Dee, and maybe we never are. But there's more going on here. Dee's pursuit of her African heritage is very important. I think both daughters here have a very legitimate claim to the quilts, and they have different views of culture and cultural heritage, as I've mentioned, and both views are important. And the quilts mean something to Maggie. They mean something to Dee as well. And Walker is subtle. She uses Mom as the narrator to help us really side with Maggie here, and but I think she's subtly trying to get us to think more about this, and I think Dee's approach is wrong. I think that's not in question, that Dee could go about this in a different way, but I think we're also not to dismiss Dee's perspective outright just because of how she goes about it. There's a point here about her African heritage that's very important. But there's a larger point Walker is making about the relations between African American heritage and African heritage, right? There's important heritage that goes all the way back to Africa that African Americans, it should matter to them. And I think Walker's making that point, but she's saying there's a new tradition here in the U.S. that may have come as a result of some of the worst possible things that have ever happened in human history, but nonetheless, there's a distinctly African American culture that now exists, and both are important. And so, the issue here is not which one's more important. The issue here is how do we reconcile the tension between the two. And Dee's problem is not that she values her heritage. It's that she's rejecting another form of heritage that's also very important. And how she goes about it is not a kind or loving way. And that's why Maggie ultimately gets the quilts. But in seeing all of that, Walker gives us so much to think about. Family relations amongst African Americans, but moreover, family relations amongst all people. Her story really communicates a lot. So with all of that in mind, here are some different questions to think about. At this point in their lives, Maggie and Dee clearly belong to different communities. So there's kind of the everyday use homespun community that is more about the most recent traditions and heritage for Maggie, and then the very important African roots that Dee is pursuing. So they belong to different communities. But how do these communities shape their identities? Remember that question about the relationship between community and identity that we've been pursuing all along, all throughout this lecture. How does that, with clearly two different communities here, how does community inform the formulation of identity in this particular story? Because I would say identity is like the most important theme in this story, you could argue. Why do you think Walker chose to make Mama the narrator? Consider how the story would be different if told from someone else's perspective. What would it be like if told from Maggie's perspective? What would it be like if told from Dee's perspective? So just kind of imagine here what it would be like in other scenarios, and that might help you answer the main question of why do you think Walker chose to make Mama the narrator? There's a lot there. I mean, you can think about how if it were for someone else's perspective, it would be even more one-sided than it already is. Mama's certainly not neutral, but she's also not one of the daughters. She's the mama. But there's much more to it than that. That's just scratching the surface. So how is this a vibrant, beautiful, brilliant story in part or mainly because it comes from Mama? Why do you think Mama chose to give the quilts to Maggie at the end of the story? What is her reasoning? We talked about that some on the previous slide, but there's more to it. Now, play devil's advocate. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion here, she had given the quilts to Dee. Why would she do that? So think about that for a little bit. I'm really curious to see what you think. But ultimately, she did give them to Maggie. So do you agree with that choice? Do you think that was the right choice? Why or why not? Finally, consider the quote from the beginning of the lecture, that outside social forces, such as injustice, etc., have influenced families and caused the tension, the strife, the cruelty. Do you believe that's true? If so, to what degree? Do we see that in the story here? And ultimately, by thinking about that question, you can ask, what does the story teach us about sibling relationships? And that might be the most important question we try to answer as we read this story.